Alice Johnson's peaceful life in Willow Creek revolved around her famous cornbread and the warmth she spread throughout the community. At 80 years old, she still maintained a vibrant energy, evident as she bustled around her sun-drenched kitchen. The aroma of freshly baked cornbread filled the air, a recipe passed down through generations. As she worked, Alice's mind wandered to her childhood memories. Growing up during segregation had been challenging, but her family's strength and resilience had seen them through. She remembered her father's quiet determination as he faced daily discrimination at work, and her mother's unwavering spirit as she fought for their right to education. These memories weren't just history to Alice. They were the foundation of her character. The tranquility of her morning was abruptly shattered when a group of neo-Nazis appeared at her door. Led by a man named Mark, they surrounded her house with aggressive intent. Their shouts and insults pierced the air, demands for her to leave echoing through the neighborhood. The contrast between their hatred and Alice's peaceful home was stark. Faced with this hostility, Alice did something unexpected. Instead of cowering or responding with anger, she opened her door with a serene smile. The neo-Nazis, momentarily taken aback by her calm demeanor, fell silent. Alice's next words surprised them even more. "Why don't you all come in for some lemonade and cornbread?" she offered, her voice steady and warm. The invitation hung in the air, challenging the group's preconceptions. They had come to intimidate, to spread fear, but were met instead with kindness. Alice's actions weren't naive. They were a deliberate choice to confront hatred with humanity. As she stood in the doorway, her offer still open, the neo-Nazis found themselves at a crossroads. Accept her invitation and step into unknown territory, or maintain their aggressive stance. The tension was palpable as the group hesitated, unsure how to respond to this unexpected turn of events. Alice's unwavering smile and open doors stood as a powerful symbol of resistance against their hate, not through force, but through compassion. The scene inside Alice's house was surreal. The elderly African-American woman sat at her dining table, surrounded by a group of neo-Nazis who had moments ago been shouting slurs at her. Alice, maintaining her composure, poured lemonade and offered her famous cornbread to the bewildered men. As they hesitantly took their seats, Alice began to speak. Her voice was calm and measured as she shared stories from her childhood. She talked about growing up in the segregated South, the challenges her family faced, and the small victories they celebrated. She spoke of her father's dignity in the face of daily humiliations and her mother's quiet strength as she fought for their rights. Alice's words weren't accusatory. Instead, they painted a vivid picture of a life lived with resilience and hope. She emphasized the importance of fighting against hatred, not with more hatred, but with understanding and compassion. The neo-Nazis, who had come to intimidate, found themselves listening, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Meanwhile, Jamila, Alice's granddaughter, watched the scene unfold from a distance. Her emotions were a turbulent mix of fear, anger, and awe. She was terrified for her grandmother's safety, angry at the audacity of these men, but also amazed by Alice's courage. Jamila's hand hovered over her phone, torn between calling the police and respecting her grandmother's approach. As she debated her next move, Jamila noticed something unexpected. The tension in the room was slowly shifting. The aggressive postures of some of the men were relaxing, their expressions changing from hostility to confusion, and in some cases, to genuine interest. One man in particular caught Jamila's attention. Jake, sitting closest to Alice, seemed to be hanging on her every word. His face showed a conflict brewing within him. As Alice spoke about her experiences, Jake's eyes reflected a growing unease. He fidgeted with his hands, occasionally nodding as if in agreement with Alice's words. It became clear that Jake was more than just listening. He was connecting Alice's stories to his own life experiences. When she mentioned the importance of community and belonging, Jake's expression changed noticeably. It was as if Alice's words were unlocking memories or feelings he had long suppressed. As the conversation continued, the atmosphere in the room transformed. What had started as a hostile confrontation was evolving into something entirely different, a moment of unexpected connection and reflection. Alice's storytelling took a more personal turn as she shared the story of her mother. She spoke of a woman who, despite facing daily discrimination, always found ways to help others. Her mother's unwavering kindness in the face of adversity had left a lasting impact on Alice. As Alice recounted her mother's experiences, Jake's internal conflict intensified. He found himself drawing parallels between Alice's mother's struggles and his own challenges as a war veteran. The concept of maintaining compassion in difficult circumstances resonated deeply with him, forcing him to question his recent life choices. Jake's reactions didn't go unnoticed by Mark, the group's leader. Mark maintained a hostile demeanor, his jaw clenched and eyes narrowed as he listened to Alice. However, beneath his tough exterior, doubt began to creep in. The love and kindness in Alice's words challenged the hate-filled ideology he had clung to for so long. As Alice continued, she described how her mother had once helped a white family in need, despite the racial tensions of the time. This act of kindness had led to a friendship that transcended social barriers. Mark found himself struggling to reconcile this story with his beliefs about racial separation and superiority. The atmosphere in the room shifted subtly. Some of the men who had arrived full of aggression now sat in contemplative silence. Alice's words were having an effect, chipping away at the walls of prejudice they had built around themselves. Sensing the change, Alice decided to lighten the mood. She stood up and brought more cornbread to the table, its warm, comforting aroma filling the room. "Would anyone like some more?" she asked, her voice gentle and inviting. This simple act of hospitality created a moment of unexpected normalcy. Some of the men, including Jake, accepted the offer. As they ate, the tension in the room noticeably decreased. Conversation began to flow more naturally, with some of the men asking questions about Alice's life and experiences. Mark, however, remained guarded. He watched his companions engaging with Alice, a mix of confusion and anger playing across his face. The situation was veering far from their original intentions, and he was losing control of the narrative he had carefully constructed for his followers. As the group continued to talk and eat, the lines between us and them began to blur. What had started as a confrontation was evolving into a dialogue, challenging long-held beliefs and opening minds to new perspectives. Outside the house, Jamila battled with her conflicting emotions. Her concern for her grandmother's safety warred with her curiosity about the unexpected turn of events unfolding inside. Unable to bear the suspense any longer, she made a decision. Taking a deep breath, Jamila cautiously approached the house, her heart pounding with each step. As Jamila neared, she could hear the low murmur of conversation through the open windows. The absence of shouting or signs of violence both relieved and puzzled her. She hesitated at the door, unsure of what she might find inside. Meanwhile, inside the house, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Jake, the ex-soldier, suddenly stood up, drawing everyone's attention. His face was a mask of vulnerability, a stark contrast to the tough exterior he had shown earlier. In a voice thick with emotion, he began to share his own story. Jake spoke of his experiences in the war, the trauma he had endured, and the overwhelming loneliness he felt upon returning home. He described how he had struggled to find his place in civilian life, feeling disconnected from a society that seemed unable to understand his experiences. It was this sense of isolation, he admitted, that had led him to join the neo-Nazi group. "I was looking for somewhere to belong," Jake confessed, his eyes downcast. "I thought I'd found it with these guys, but now, I'm not so sure." The room fell silent as Jake's words sank in. His companions shifted uncomfortably, some avoiding eye contact while others nodded in recognition of similar feelings. Alice listened intently, her face a picture of empathy. When Jake finished speaking, she leaned forward, her aged hands clasped on the table. "Finding belonging is important," she said gently, "but it's equally important to ensure that where we seek that belonging aligns with our true values." She went on to talk about the various ways people can find positive connections in their communities. She spoke of volunteer work, support groups for veterans, and the power of reaching out to others who might be feeling equally lost. "Hate may seem like a strong bond," Alice continued, her voice firm but kind, "but it's a destructive one. True belonging comes from connections built on understanding, empathy, and shared humanity." Jake nodded slowly, absorbing Alice's words. The internal conflict was evident on his face as he grappled with the implications of what she was saying. He had joined the group seeking acceptance and camaraderie, but Alice's words made him question whether this was truly the kind of belonging he wanted. As Jake sat back down, visibly shaken by his own admission and Alice's response, the atmosphere in the room had transformed once again. The other men looked at Jake with a mix of surprise and uncertainty, seeing their comrade in a new light. Alice's wisdom had not only touched Jake, but had also planted seeds of doubt in the minds of the others. Outside, Jamila, who had been listening at the door, found herself re-evaluating her perception of the situation. What she had expected to be a confrontation had become something far more complex and potentially transformative. The tension in the room reached a new peak as Mark, the group's leader, abruptly stood up. His face was a mask of conflicting emotions: anger, confusion, and a hint of vulnerability. "You don't understand," he burst out, his voice trembling slightly. "This isn't just about hate. It's about... Mark struggled to find the words, his usual bravado crumbling. In a moment of unexpected honesty, he revealed the deep-seated insecurities that fueled his anger. He spoke of feeling powerless in a changing world, of economic anxieties, and of a fear of losing his identity. His words came out in a rush, as if a dam had broken. "I thought hating others would make me feel stronger, but it just made me angrier," Mark admitted, his shoulders sagging. Alice listened attentively, her eyes filled with understanding rather than judgment. When Mark finished, she spoke softly but firmly. "Anger is often a mask for fear and pain," she said, "but it's not the only answer. There are other ways to address these feelings, ways that don't harm others or yourself." Sensing an opportunity for deeper understanding, Alice made a suggestion. "Why don't we all share a bit about our families, our histories? Sometimes, understanding where we come from can help us see where we're going." The proposal was met with hesitation. The men exchanged uncertain glances, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of exposing their personal lives. But Alice's gentle encouragement and the vulnerability already shown by Jake and Mark had created a crack in their defenses. Slowly, one by one, they began to open up. A man named Tom spoke of his grandfather, a factory worker who lost his job and struggled with alcoholism. Another, Chris, shared the story of his single mother who worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table. Each story revealed layers of pain, struggle, and the complex tapestry of experiences that had shaped their worldviews. As they spoke, a common thread emerged: stories of economic hardship, feeling left behind by society, and a desperate search for someone to blame. Alice listened intently to each narrative, occasionally asking questions that prompted deeper reflection. The atmosphere in the room transformed as these men, who had arrived as a unified front of hate, began to see each other as individuals with unique stories and shared struggles. The ideological armor they had worn began to show cracks, revealing the vulnerable humans beneath. Jake, who had been quiet since his earlier confession, spoke up again. "I never knew. We never really talked about this stuff before," he said, looking around at his companions with new eyes. Alice nodded, understanding the significance of this moment. "It's often easier to focus on what makes us different," she said. "But when we share our stories, we often find that we have more in common than we thought." As the last person finished speaking, a heavy silence fell over the room. The air was thick with unspoken emotions: shame, empathy, confusion, and the first tentative tendrils of understanding. What had begun as an act of intimidation had become an unexpected journey of self-reflection and shared humanity. The tense atmosphere was suddenly broken by the sound of the front door opening. Jamila, unable to contain her concern any longer, stepped into the house. Her entrance was met with startled looks from the group of men, who instinctively tensed up at the new presence. Jamila's eyes quickly scanned the room, taking in the unexpected scene before her. Instead of the confrontation she had feared, she found a group engaged in what appeared to be an intense but civil conversation. Her grandmother sat at the head of the table, calm and composed as ever, surrounded by the very men who had come to threaten her. "Grandma?" Jamila's voice was a mixture of confusion and relief. Alice smiled warmly at her granddaughter. "Jamila, dear. Come join us. We're just having a conversation." Hesitantly, Jamila moved further into the room. She observed the men closely, noting their subdued demeanor and the absence of any overt hostility. Some looked uncomfortable, others appeared deep in thought, and a few even nodded in acknowledgement of her presence. As Jamila took a seat next to her grandmother, she began to pick up on the nuances of the conversation. She listened as the men spoke about their personal histories and struggles, sharing vulnerabilities she never expected to hear from a group that had arrived with such aggression. The juxtaposition of what Jamila had anticipated and what she was witnessing left her feeling both relieved and perplexed. She watched her grandmother navigate the conversation with grace and wisdom, gently challenging preconceptions while offering understanding and compassion. As the discussion continued, Jake, who had been quiet for a while, suddenly spoke up. His voice was low, almost reverent, as he addressed Alice. "Ma'am, I don't understand. How do you do it? How can you sit here with us, be kind to us, after everything? After what we came here to do?" The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Alice. Even Jamila leaned in, curious to hear her grandmother's response. Alice took a moment before answering, her eyes filled with a lifetime of experiences. "It's a choice," she began, her voice steady and clear. "Every day, we have the choice to meet hatred with more hatred, or to break that cycle with kindness. It's not always easy, believe me, but I've seen too much in my life to believe that hate can ever truly win." She paused, looking around the room at each face before continuing. "Kindness isn't weakness. It takes incredible strength to show compassion to those who show you none. But I believe that's the only way to truly change hearts and minds." Jake nodded slowly, clearly struggling with the weight of her words. "But doesn't it hurt? To keep being kind when the world can be so cruel?" Alice reached out and patted Jake's hand gently. "Sometimes it does, but the alternative hurts more. Holding on to anger and hate, that eats you up inside. Being kind, even when it's hard, that's what keeps hope alive. And hope, my dear, is what changes the world." The room fell into a contemplative silence as everyone, including Jamila, absorbed Alice's words. The atmosphere had shifted once again, filled now with a sense of quiet reflection and the first tentative seeds of transformation. Alice's words hung in the air, their impact visible on the faces of everyone in the room. She continued, her voice gentle but firm. "Kindness is a choice we make every day. It's not always easy, but it's always possible. Even in the darkest times, we have the capacity to choose compassion over hate." Jake, visibly moved by Alice's wisdom, leaned forward. "But how? How do you maintain that kindness when everything around you seems to push you towards anger and resentment?" Alice smiled softly. "It's a practice, like any other. You start small. You look for the humanity in others, even when they're not showing it to you. You remember that behind every angry face is a person with their own struggles and pain." As Alice spoke, Mark, who had been quiet for some time, stirred in his seat. His face was a mask of conflicting emotions. "But what if you've done things you're not proud of? What if you've hurt people?" His voice was barely above a whisper. Alice turned to him, her eyes filled with understanding. "We've all made mistakes, Mark. The question is, what do we do with those mistakes? Do we let them define us, or do we use them as a catalyst for change?" Mark nodded slowly, his eyes downcast. "I don't know if I can be different. I don't know if I even know how to be different anymore." "The fact that you're asking these questions shows that change is already happening within you," Alice responded gently. The conversation intensified as other members of the group began to voice their own doubts and questions. One man spoke of his fear of losing his identity if he let go of his hateful beliefs. Another expressed concern about backlash from friends and family if he changed his views. Alice listened patiently to each concern, offering words of encouragement and wisdom. She spoke about the courage it takes to challenge one's own beliefs and the freedom that comes with letting go of hate. Jamila, who had been quietly observing, couldn't help but be amazed at her grandmother's ability to guide this difficult conversation. She watched as these men, who had arrived full of anger and hate, began to wrestle with their beliefs in real time. As the discussion continued, Alice skillfully steered it towards more practical matters. What would it look like, she asked, to start building a life based on understanding rather than hate? What small steps could each of you take? This question sparked a new round of conversation. Jake talked about wanting to reconnect with his diverse group of army buddies. Another man mentioned his interest in community service. Even Mark, still visibly struggling, spoke hesitantly about wanting to learn more about the people he had previously demonized. Throughout this exchange, Alice maintained her role as a gentle guide, offering suggestions and encouragement. She emphasized the importance of education, open dialogue, and actively seeking out diverse perspectives. As the conversation wound down, there was a palpable sense of shift in the room. The anger and tension that had filled the space when the group first arrived had been replaced by a complex mix of emotions: uncertainty, hope, and the first glimmers of understanding. As the intense conversation continued inside, the weather outside began to change dramatically. Dark clouds rolled in, obscuring the once clear sky. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the trees surrounding Alice's house. The approaching storm seemed to mirror the emotional turbulence within the room. Inside, oblivious to the changing weather, Alice sensed that it was time to shift the focus of their discussion. "You know," she began, her voice cutting through the tension, "we've talked a lot about our differences and our struggles, but what about our shared experiences? What does it mean to be part of a community?" Her question hung in the air as a low rumble of thunder sounded in the distance. The group looked at one another, uncertain how to respond. "Why don't we all join in a circle?" Alice suggested, slowly rising from her chair. "It might help us feel more connected as we talk about this." Hesitantly, the men began to move. Chairs scraped against the floor as they rearranged themselves into a rough circle. Jamila, after a moment's hesitation, joined them, sitting next to her grandmother. As they settled, Alice spoke again. "In a community, we're all connected, whether we realize it or not. Our actions affect each other, for better or worse. So, let's each share what community means to us." One by one, they began to speak. Some talked about their neighborhoods, others about their families or groups of friends. As they shared, a common theme emerged: the desire for belonging, for acceptance, for a place to call home. Outside, the storm intensified. Rain began to pelt against the windows, and flashes of lightning illuminated the darkening sky. The worsening weather seemed to create a cocoon around the group, isolating them from the outside world and intensifying the intimacy of their conversation. As the sharing continued, Jake's turn came. He took a deep breath, his face a mixture of determination and fear. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice barely audible over the rain. I don't think I want to be part of this group anymore." His words fell like a bombshell in the room. The other men stared at him in shock, some with anger, others with confusion. Jake continued, his voice growing stronger. "What we've been doing, it's not right. It's not who I want to be. I joined because I was looking for brotherhood, for a purpose. But this isn't it." Mark, visibly agitated, leaned forward. "You can't just walk away, Jake. You know too much. You're one of us." But Jake shook his head. "No, I'm not. Not anymore. I don't want to live with this hate anymore. I want to be better." The tension in the room skyrocketed. Some of Jake's former friends began to shout, accusing him of betrayal. Others sat in stunned silence. The storm outside reached its peak, a loud crack of thunder punctuating the chaos in the room. Suddenly, a window shattered, likely from a branch thrown by the wind. Everyone jumped, the unexpected noise cutting through the arguing. For a moment, the room was eerily quiet, save for the sound of rain and wind entering through the broken window. In that moment of shock, the fragility of their situation became clear. The broken window seemed to symbolize the shattering of old beliefs, the intrusion of a new reality into their carefully constructed world of hate and division. As they all stared at the broken glass, the realization began to dawn that something fundamental had changed. The storm both outside and inside the house had reached its climax, and in its wake, nothing would be the same. The shattered window seemed to have broken more than just glass. In its aftermath, the tension in the room reached a boiling point. Mark and several others turned on Jake, their faces contorted with anger and betrayal. "You can't just walk away from us." Mark shouted, taking a threatening step towards Jake. The others closed in, creating a menacing circle around their former comrade. Alice, displaying a strength that belied her years, quickly intervened. She stepped between Jake and the advancing group, her voice calm but firm. Now, let's not forget that we're all human beings here. Violence and threats won't solve anything. The men hesitated, caught off guard by Alice's boldness. She continued, her words cutting through the hostility. Remember what we've been discussing. Love is stronger than hate. It takes more courage to change than to stay the same. Jake, emboldened by Alice's support, stood his ground. He looked each of his former friends in the eye as he spoke. I know you're angry. I know you feel betrayed. But can't you see? This isn't who we have to be. We have a choice. He took a deep breath before continuing, his voice growing stronger with each word. I've seen what hate does. In war, in our communities, and in ourselves. It destroys everything it touches. I don't want that anymore. I want to build, not destroy. Mark, still seething, spat back, You're weak, Jake. You've let this old lady fill your head with nonsense. But Jake shook his head, a sad smile on his face. No, Mark. For the first time in a long time, I feel strong. Strong enough to admit I was wrong. Strong enough to change. As Jake spoke, the storm outside began to subside. The wind died down, and the rain lessened to a gentle patter. It was as if nature itself was listening, holding its breath as this drama unfolded. Jamila, who had been watching the scene with a mixture of fear and awe, suddenly noticed something. Jake's sleeve had ridden up slightly, revealing part of a tattoo on his forearm. It wasn't one of the hate symbols she had expected to see. Instead, it looked like a dove. Jake, she said, her voice cutting through the tension. What's that on your arm? All eyes turned to Jake as he slowly rolled up his sleeve, revealing a beautifully intricate tattoo of a dove carrying an olive branch with a name and date inscribed below it. This, Jake said, his voice thick with emotion, is for my best friend, Michael. He died in the war, saving a local family we were supposed to be protecting. He was black. Jake's eyes met Mark's as he continued, Michael taught me what real brotherhood means. I got this tattoo to honor him, to remind myself of what really matters. I've been hiding from his memory, for too long. The revelation hung in the air, its impact visible on the faces of everyone in the room. The contradiction between Jake's hidden tattoo and the ideology he had espoused was stark, undeniable. In the silence that followed, the gentle sound of rain seemed to emphasize the weight of the moment. The storm had passed, both outside and within the room, leaving in its wake a sense of cleansing, of new possibilities. The group stood frozen, the anger of moments ago replaced by confusion and, in some faces, the first flickers of understanding. They were confronted not just with Jake's decision to leave, but with the complex reality of their own beliefs and choices. As the last rumbles of thunder faded in the distance, it became clear that this moment was more than just a confrontation. It was the beginning of a profound change, a challenge to each person in that room to question their deepest held beliefs and to consider a different path forward. The revelation of Jake's tattoo had left the room in a state of stunned silence. However, this moment of quiet reflection was shattered when one of the group members, overcome with a mixture of confusion and anger, lunged towards Jake. "You traitor!" he shouted, his fist raised. In a display of remarkable agility, Alice swiftly positioned herself between Jake and his attacker. Despite the significant age difference, she stood firm, her eyes blazing with determination. "Stop," Alice commanded, her voice ringing with authority. "The real strength isn't in your fists, young man. It's in having the courage to choose peace, even when everything in you wants to fight." The man froze, his fist still raised but now trembling slightly. Alice's words and actions had caught him off guard, challenging his ingrained responses. Seizing this moment, Jake stepped forward. His voice was calm but filled with conviction as he addressed his former companions. "I've been living a lie," he admitted. "The truth is, I've always been a defender of peace. That's why I joined the army in the first place, to protect people, not to hate them." Jake rolled up his sleeve further, revealing the full extent of his tattoo. "This isn't just a memorial for Michael. It's a reminder of who I really am and who I want to be." The group stared at Jake's arm, the dove and olive branch a stark contrast to the hate symbols some of them bore. The dissonance was palpable, forcing each of them to confront the contradictions in their own beliefs. Mark, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. His voice was hesitant, lacking its usual bravado. "But if you felt this way, why did you join us? Why did you spout all that hate?" Jake's response was tinged with sadness. "Because I was lost. Because hating others seemed easier than dealing with my own pain. But I was wrong. So wrong." As Jake spoke, a change came over the room. The anger and tension that had dominated earlier began to dissipate, replaced by a heavy, contemplative silence. Each person seemed lost in their own thoughts, grappling with the implications of Jake's words. Alice, sensing the shift, gently addressed the group. "What Jake has shown us today takes immense courage. It's not easy to admit when we're wrong, to challenge our own beliefs. But it's in these moments that we have the opportunity to grow, to become better versions of ourselves." Her words seemed to resonate with some of the men. A few nodded slowly, while others looked conflicted, years of ingrained beliefs warring with the new ideas presented to them. Jamila, who had been watching the scene unfold, stepped forward. "I think what my grandmother and Jake are trying to say is that the real fight isn't against other people. It's against ignorance, against the hatred within ourselves." As Jamila's words sank in, the atmosphere in the room transformed. The group of men who had arrived as a unified front of hate now stood as individuals, each confronting their own beliefs and choices. Some looked ashamed, others confused. A few seemed angry still, but it was an anger tinged with uncertainty. Mark, the former leader, appeared lost, his usual confidence shattered. In this moment of collective self-reflection, Alice spoke once more, her voice gentle but firm. "Change isn't easy, and it doesn't happen overnight. But recognizing the need for change is the first step. Each of you has that choice now, to continue down the path of hate, or to choose a different way." As Alice's words hung in the air, the room fell into a profound silence. The storm outside had fully passed, and rays of sunlight began to peek through the broken window, symbolizing the glimmer of hope in this pivotal moment. The scene ended with this tableau. A diverse group of individuals, each wrestling with their own thoughts and emotions, united in a moment of silent reflection. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, possibilities beyond hate had been unveiled, challenging each person to reconsider their path forward.